The old man kept appearing and disappearing as we moved through the village. Something felt wrong. 30 seconds later, the first shots rang out, and I woke up days later in a hospital, not knowing if my team had survived. People usually remember the day everything changed. For me, it wasn't the gunfire itself. It was the silence just before it. Our platoon had been operating in Iraq's Nineveh province for several months. By then, patrols had become routine. Every mission was different, but they all started the same way: checking gear, reviewing intelligence, joking with each other to keep the mood light. You learn very quickly that laughter is one of the best ways to deal with stress. That morning, our objective was straightforward. Intelligence suggested that a man living near a small farming settlement was helping insurgent cells build roadside bombs. We weren't there to kick in doors. The plan was to gather information, speak with local leaders, and determine whether the reports were accurate. I was serving as the point man that day. Walking first was never glamorous, but somebody had to do it. Every step mattered. Every ditch, every broken wall, every pile of trash could hide something capable of ending a patrol in seconds. By that point, I trusted my team completely. There wasn't a single person behind me I wouldn't trust with my life. That's what makes military service different from almost anything else. You're not just co-workers. You're responsible for bringing each other home. I grew up in a small town where joining the army always seemed like the obvious path. My grandfather served decades earlier, and hearing his stories made military service feel like more than just a job. I wanted purpose. I wanted to challenge myself. Most importantly, I wanted to belong to something larger than myself. So I enlisted. Basic training wasn't nearly as difficult as people imagine. Physically, sure, it pushed everyone. But mentally, it was simple. You wake up. You're told where to go. You're told what to wear. You're told what to do. Your job is to execute. The difficult part comes later, when nobody can predict what's waiting around the next corner. After infantry training, I deployed to Iraq sooner than I expected. One day, I was still getting used to army life. A few months later, I was walking through villages in Nineveh province carrying live ammunition. Reality catches up quickly. Nineveh is nothing like most people imagine. When people think about Iraq, they picture endless desert. There certainly is desert, but there are also rivers, farmland, orchards, irrigation canals, and old villages that have existed for generations. The landscape can actually be beautiful. Unfortunately, beauty doesn't make a place safe. Every abandoned vehicle looked suspicious. Every dirt road could hide an explosive. Every rooftop became something you automatically checked without thinking. Eventually, those habits stop feeling like habits. They become instinct. During our first weeks, we spent more time talking than fighting. We met tribal elders. We coordinated with local security forces. We tried to understand who genuinely wanted peace and who was simply waiting for us to leave. Sometimes kids followed us through the streets asking for candy or bottled water. Other days, nobody came outside at all. Those were usually the days that made us nervous. Silence can be louder than gunfire. As point man, I carried equipment designed to detect buried explosives. It required patience, concentration, experience. After enough patrols, you begin recognizing subtle differences. Certain ground doesn't look right. Fresh dirt stands out. Loose rocks appear where they shouldn't. Tiny details save lives. There were days I found devices before anyone else stepped near them. Whenever that happened, I reminded myself that every careful decision mattered. Not because of medals, because every soldier behind me had parents, brothers, sisters, wives, husbands, or children waiting for them back home. That responsibility never leaves your mind. The morning everything changed felt almost ordinary. We crossed an irrigation canal shortly after sunrise. The weather was warm, but not unbearable. Our radios stayed quiet. No contact, no explosions. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed an older man standing outside a small stone house. He wasn't doing anything threatening. He simply watched us. At first, I ignored it. Villagers watched coalition patrols all the time. But after several minutes, he disappeared. Then he returned. Then disappeared again. Every time we changed direction, somehow he managed to appear nearby. Nobody else seemed particularly interested in what we were doing. Only him. I mentioned it quietly over the radio. "Keep an eye on the old man." Nobody argued. Everyone had started noticing him too. I couldn't explain why, but something about the situation felt wrong. You spend enough time on deployment, and eventually your instincts become impossible to ignore. Sometimes you can't explain why you feel danger. You just know. Unfortunately, that feeling turned out to be right. We continued moving toward the village center, following a narrow dirt lane bordered by low stone walls and date palms. Visibility wasn't great. The walls forced us into a single-file formation, limiting how much we could see ahead. The older man had vanished again. That bothered me more than anything. Just a minute earlier, he'd been standing outside his courtyard, pretending to sweep dust from the entrance. Then, without warning, he was gone. I looked over my shoulder. "Where'd that guy go?" I asked. A couple of the guys turned to look. Nobody answered. Nobody had seen him leave. I felt every instinct telling me something was about to happen. We slowed our pace slightly. The patrol leader quietly reminded everyone to maintain spacing. Nobody panicked. There was no reason to. At least not yet. About 30 seconds later, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Someone stepped out from behind a weathered concrete wall. At first glance, he looked like any other civilian. Plain clothes, no visible weapon, nothing unusual. I shifted my attention back toward the ground for a second. Then he moved again, this time faster. That tiny movement was enough. I instinctively raised my rifle toward him. At exactly the same moment, he pulled an AK pattern rifle from beneath a long robe. Everything happened in less than a second. The first burst echoed through the alley before anyone could react. Rounds struck the wall beside me. Fragments of concrete exploded into the air. Then I felt the impact. One hit my leg, another slammed into my side. For a split second, I couldn't even process what had happened. It felt like being hit by a speeding truck. Not sharp, just unbelievably violent. Then the pain arrived. People often say you don't feel anything because of adrenaline. That wasn't my experience. I remember every single second, every impact, every breath, every heartbeat. The pain was immediate, intense, overwhelming. I tried to return fire, but my body simply wouldn't cooperate. My legs gave out beneath me. I hit the ground hard. Dust filled the air around me. Somewhere behind me, I heard my teammates shouting. Then came the sound every infantryman recognizes instantly. Incoming fire from multiple directions. This wasn't a single attacker. The initial shooter had only been the signal. The ambush had begun. Training takes over when your mind struggles to keep up. The squad immediately spread out, returning fire towards several positions while trying to reach me. I could hear rifles, machine guns, commands over the radio, someone yelling for a medic. Everything blended together into one constant roar. I tried crawling toward the nearest wall. Every movement felt impossible. My left arm barely responded. Blood soaked through my uniform almost immediately. I remember looking down and thinking, that's a lot more blood than I expected. Oddly enough, the mind notices strange little details during moments like that. I remember staring at dust collecting on my gloves. I remember hearing birds fly away after the shooting started. I remember thinking how unbelievably blue the sky looked. Those memories stay with you. The shooter reappeared briefly. He looked directly at me. For a moment, we locked eyes. He raised his weapon again. I honestly believed that was it. But before he fired, several rounds from my teammates struck the wall beside him. Chunks of concrete exploded around his position. He disappeared behind cover and ran. That bought me a few more seconds. Sometimes survival comes down to seconds. The medic reached me under fire. I'll never forget that. He dropped beside me without hesitation. No concern for himself. Only concern for getting me alive to the evacuation point. He checked the wounds quickly, applied tourniquets, packed the bleeding, kept talking to me the entire time. "Stay with me, Taylor. You hear me? You're not done yet." Those words mattered more than he probably realized. Because when you're lying on the ground, wondering if you're dying, hearing another human voice telling you to keep fighting becomes incredibly powerful. The firefight continued while the rest of the platoon established security around us. Radio traffic increased. Air support had been requested. A medical evacuation helicopter was on standby. But first we had to reach a landing zone outside the village. That was easier said than done. Every meter felt like a mile. My teammates lifted me onto a litter and started moving. I remember apologizing, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I felt like I was slowing everyone down. Looking back now, that sounds ridiculous. At the time, it made perfect sense. Soldiers hate becoming the reason everyone else has to take additional risks. But nobody complained. Not once. They simply carried me and kept moving. Every single step brought us closer to getting out alive. By the time we reached the extraction point, I could feel myself fading in and out. The medic kept checking my pulse every few seconds. Someone held an IV bag above me, while another soldier kept pressure on the wounds. The world started becoming strangely quiet. Not because the gunfire had stopped, because my body was beginning to shut everything else out. I remember trying to focus on simple things. The sound of helicopter blades, the weight of my body armor, the voices of the guys around me, anything that reminded me I was still there. When the evacuation helicopter finally appeared overhead, I've never been happier to hear rotor blades. Dust exploded into the air as it landed. The crew wasted no time. They loaded me inside while the rest of my platoon secured the landing zone. I wanted to say something before the doors closed. Instead, I simply looked back at my team. Some of them gave me a thumbs up. Others nodded. Nobody said goodbye. In the military, you never say goodbye before an evacuation. You say, "See you later," because everyone wants to believe you'll come back. Inside the helicopter, everything moved incredibly fast. The flight medic immediately started cutting away what remained of my uniform. Blood covered almost everything. He checked my airway, started additional IV lines, continued monitoring my blood pressure. I remember asking him one question. "Did everybody else make it?" He looked at me for a second before answering. "They're still fighting. Your job right now is staying alive." That answer told me everything I needed to know. The battle wasn't over. My friends were still out there, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to help them. That feeling was harder to accept than the pain. The helicopter landed at a coalition medical facility less than an hour later. From there, everything became a blur. Doctors, nurses, bright lights, people speaking all at once. Someone asked me my name. Another asked what day it was. Someone else counted backwards while checking my reactions. I answered what I could. The rest disappeared into fragments. I remember hearing one doctor say, "Pressure's dropping." Another replied, "Get blood ready." Then everything went dark. The next clear memory I have came much later. I opened my eyes inside an intensive care room. Machines surrounded the bed. Every movement hurt. Even breathing required effort. My mouth felt completely dry. For several seconds I couldn't understand where I was. Then everything came back. The patrol, the alley, the shooting, my platoon, the helicopter. I looked down. Bandages covered nearly half my body. My shoulder was heavily wrapped. My left arm barely moved. My leg felt like it weighed 100 pounds. That's when reality finally settled in. This wasn't a minor injury. My life had changed. Over the next several days, doctors explained exactly what had happened. Multiple rounds had struck my lower body and upper torso. Emergency surgery had stopped the bleeding. Several damaged blood vessels had been repaired. Fragments had injured muscles and nerves. Recovery would take months, possibly years. Nobody could guarantee what function would eventually return. At 23 years old, that wasn't something I was prepared to hear. Until then, I had always assumed injuries happened to someone else. You train, you prepare, you tell yourself you'll make it home. Actually lying in that hospital bed forces you to confront something completely different. You realize your future now depends on things you can no longer control. A few days later, members of my platoon finally contacted me. Some called. Others sent messages through mutual friends. Every conversation started exactly the same way. You scared the hell out of us. Then they started telling me what happened after I was evacuated. The ambush had eventually been broken. Coalition aircraft arrived overhead. The attackers scattered before they could regroup. Most importantly, everyone from my squad made it home that day. That news lifted a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying. For days I'd worried that someone else had been killed trying to save me. Knowing they survived became the greatest relief I could have received. I wasn't the only one who got a second chance. All of us did. And that realization stayed with me long after the physical wounds began to heal. After several weeks in the military hospital, I was transferred to a rehabilitation center. By then, the surgeries were over, but the real work was only beginning. People often assume recovery ends once the wounds are closed. It doesn't. That's where the hardest part starts. Every morning began with physical therapy. Some days I practiced standing. Other days I worked on bending my leg just a few degrees farther than the day before. Progress was measured in inches, not miles. At first, even sitting up without assistance felt like a victory. The therapists refused to let me feel sorry for myself. They understood exactly how soldiers think. Whenever I became frustrated, they reminded me that recovery wasn't a race. It was another mission. One objective at a time. One step at a time. That mindset helped. Military training teaches you to focus on the next task instead of the entire mountain ahead. Instead of thinking about walking normally again, I concentrated on standing. Once I could stand, I focused on taking one step, then another. Eventually, those small victories started adding up. The emotional recovery took much longer. At night, I often replayed the ambush in my mind. I could still hear the first burst of gunfire. I remembered the sound of bullets striking the walls around us. Sometimes I woke up convinced I was back in that narrow alley. It usually took a few moments before I realized I was safe. Nobody had prepared me for that part. The injuries were visible. The memories weren't. One afternoon, the medic who had treated me during the firefight came to visit. The moment he walked into the room, I stood up as much as I could and shook his hand. He laughed and told me I didn't owe him anything. I disagreed. Without his quick decisions that morning, I probably wouldn't have survived long enough to reach surgery. We talked for hours, not just about the ambush, but about everything afterward. He admitted there had been moments when he wasn't sure I'd make it. I admitted there had been moments when I had almost given up. Neither of us had ever said those things out loud before. It was one of the most honest conversations I've ever had. Months passed before I was finally able to return home. Walking through my front door felt surreal. Everything looked exactly the way I remembered it. The photographs on the walls, the kitchen table, the backyard. Nothing had changed, except me. Family and friends wanted to celebrate. They were simply grateful I had survived. I was grateful too. But adjusting to normal life turned out to be more complicated than I expected. Crowded places made me uncomfortable. Loud noises immediately caught my attention. Whenever I entered a restaurant, I automatically looked for exits before sitting down. Those habits weren't conscious anymore. They had become part of me. Eventually, I met with other veterans who had gone through similar experiences. Listening to their stories changed my perspective. Some had lost limbs. Some carried injuries that would never fully heal. Others struggled with memories that followed them long after the fighting ended. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. Recovery isn't something you accomplish by yourself. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is accept help from people who truly understand what you're going through. That lesson took me longer to learn than any physical exercise. People occasionally ask whether I regret joining the army. The answer surprises them. No, I don't. If I could erase the pain, I would. If I could erase what my family went through, absolutely. But I don't regret serving beside the men and women I had the privilege to know. They taught me what loyalty really means. They showed me what courage looks like when nobody is watching. And on the worst day of my life, they refused to leave me behind. That's something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Those scars remind me of a terrible day. But they also remind me that I survived because of people who never stopped fighting for each other. Leaving the army was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. Not because I wanted to leave, because I wasn't sure who I was without the uniform. For years, every day had a purpose. Every mission had a clear objective. Suddenly, I found myself waking up without a briefing, without a patrol schedule, without the team I'd spent years relying on. That transition was more difficult than I expected. Recovery wasn't only about learning to walk farther or lifting heavier weights. It was about building a new life. I enrolled in college a year after leaving active duty. At first, sitting in a classroom felt completely foreign. Most of my classmates were worried about exams or weekend plans. I was still learning how to sleep through the night without waking up from old memories. There were days when I questioned whether I belonged there. But just like rehabilitation, education became another mission. One assignment, one semester, one goal at a time. Eventually, I graduated. That diploma meant just as much to me as any medal I had received, because it represented another battle that I had managed to win. Today, my injuries are still part of my everyday life. Cold weather reminds me of every surgery. Some mornings my leg is stiff before I even get out of bed. I still have scars across my side and shoulder. Those things probably won't ever disappear. I've learned not to see them as reminders of weakness. They're reminders that I survived. Every scar has a story behind it. Every scar reminds me of people who refused to give up on me. Sometimes I receive messages from young men and women thinking about joining the military. Many ask the same question. Is it worth it? I never answer that question for them. That's a decision every person has to make for themselves. What I do tell them is this: understand why you're serving. Train harder than you think you need to. Take care of the people beside you. And never assume you're invincible, because no amount of experience makes anyone bulletproof. I also tell them something else. War isn't like the movies. There are no dramatic speeches before everything changes. No music, no slow motion. Most life-changing moments begin on what feels like an ordinary morning. You drink your coffee, check your gear, talk with your friends. Then, without warning, everything is different. That's the reality very few people ever see. Looking back now, years later, I don't spend much time thinking about the man who opened fire that day. I think about the soldiers who carried me out. I think about the medic who refused to let me give up. I think about the helicopter crew who fought to keep me alive. I think about the surgeons who worked through the night. I think about my family waiting for a phone call they hoped would never come. Those are the people who deserve to be remembered, not the man who tried to take my life. If there's one lesson I carried home from Nineveh province, it's that courage rarely looks the way people imagine. Sometimes courage is charging toward danger to rescue a friend. Sometimes it's spending months learning how to walk again. Sometimes it's asking for help when you don't think you need it. And sometimes it's simply choosing to keep moving forward, even after the worst day of your life. I'm proud of my service. I'm grateful for the people who stood beside me. And every morning I wake up, I remember that survival isn't something to take for granted. It's a gift, one that was earned not by one person, but by an entire team that refused to leave one of their own behind. My name is Sergeant Taylor, and this is the story of the day that changed my life forever.